So we wanted to start out, we're starting this out with a few questions among us, and then opening up to Q&A later. The first question we wanted to start with was just one of a definition. What are destructive emotions from your perspective as either a scientist or a meditation practitioner? And we thought it might be nice to start with Father Laurence, due to the very long history of his tradition in answering this question.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you for your invitation here. And it's wonderful to be here with fellow speakers, and wonderful series to begin with. So thank you. So what are destructive emotions? I think they're tendencies built into human nature, more prominent in some people than in others, perhaps. I think they are disturbances of a natural state of peace that the human person is made for and is constructed for. They can be triggered by external circumstances or by past history or by trauma, but they're personal, of course, and the configuration is personal, but they're cyclical as well. So they're tricky, they're difficult to pin down. I think all of the contemplative monastic traditions have analyzed these destructive emotions in the early Christian monastic tradition from the desert of Egypt in the 3rd century. There became this list of the 8 principal faults, things like gluttony, fornication, greed, anger, sadness, achadia, sort of depression, vainglory, always wanting to be liked, and pride itself. And they were both contemplative practitioners and also very astute observers of the human mind. And they recognized that these tendencies or these emotions came in patterns and formed unique patterns in different individuals and needed to be treated. They were disturbances that needed to be calmed or healed. So the ones you mention here, say anger, for example, is anger destructive or helpful? Sometimes one or the other. Well, anger is one of the emotions or the faults or the obstacles that I think all of the monastic traditions focus on. If you live in a community, you're going to be angry at times, and people are angry all the time. So, so anger is a really dangerous emotion. It's dangerous if you express it in the wrong way, and it's dangerous if you repress it. It will turn into depression or self-harm. If you express it without being in control of it, it simply makes the situation worse, and you yourself are further disturbed. So there is a real and healthy expression of anger. You should be angry if you see somebody mistreating somebody else, or angry at injustices in society. There should be a prophetic, natural anger against that. But expressing it one needs to be in control. One needs to be in touch with one's own stable center. And then attachment. Attachment is, of course, very, very highly regarded in the Buddhist tradition as the cause of suffering. But attachment is the opposite of what Jesus calls poverty of spirit, the first of the Beatitudes, which is about renunciation, about letting go. And we can be attached to positive things or negative things. We can be attached to destructive patterns in our lives, addictions. We can be attached to things that we are fantasizing about and can't let go of. And the cure for that, I think, must include a serious contemplative practice followed over time, because the roots of these attachments go very deep into our psyche and have deep causes. And fear Do not fear is the most common verse in the Bible, actually. And fear, we could say, in the biblical vision, is the opposite of love. You cannot love if you are controlled by fear. I think what we understand today through contemporary psychology is the place of death, or the repression of the fear of death, as a major cause of living in anxiety or dread. And this is why St. Benedict says, keep death always before your eyes. Not in a morbid sense, but in order to be free from the repression of the fear. But there are other fears that, again, involve deep-rooted parts of our history: the fear of not being loved, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of rejection, the fear of loneliness. And again, for all of these aspects of fear, there's a variety of spiritual practices centered in meditation that can release us from the pattern or the hold of these emotions over time, with support from others. But basically, as far as fear is concerned, it's love that casts out fear, because fear is the opposite of love. Anyway, those are some opening thoughts on destructive emotions.
I think that's enough to talk about for the next 2 hours, actually, all of those questions. I wonder if Wendy or Elena might be willing to go deeper with some of those, especially anger. I think anger might be interesting to look at right now, obviously, in the world. There's an upswelling of anger on a lot of dimensions. I wonder if either of you would be willing to talk about the scientific view on anger and these questions of whether there are healthy expressions of anger and destructive expressions of anger, and how that overlaps with the contemplative view.
I can jump in a little bit, and then Elena, welcome your thoughts. Yeah, so I guess first, just kind of a blanket caveat that I'm not an emotion researcher, so I can't fully represent kind of the state of science on these particular questions. But I think in general, it was interesting to consider, a definition of destructive emotions. That's not a term I think that we really use in science, because it has a kind of ethical stance of something that is inherently bad, or it feels from that term that it would be always bad. And I think, just like Father Laurence was just describing, for most any emotion, there can be, there's reasons that there's a bodily experience, and emotion is kind of indicating that, as well as any concepts or narrative that are woven into it. So there can be often healthy and unhealthy experiences of many different kinds of emotions. So anger, for sure, is something that many people are experiencing more and more these days. Certainly in the United States, it's something that is really coming to the fore for many people for many different reasons. So I think that, yeah, I mean, just an example, using anger as an example, there could certainly be, there's a lot of experience here now of anger at injustice, and, motivating people to be in the streets and be fighting for justice and equality. And I think those are very healthy forms of anger and responding to, legitimate problems in the world. So that's an example of kind of a positive, I think, form of anger. Whereas negative forms of anger, can take more the lens of like a hatred or an othering, and directed at particular groups or people, and demonizing them. And then you start to lose the sense of interconnection. It's kind of a fundamental reality that is often missed in those states. And so that can cause you to act in harmful ways. So to me, when I think about trying to define destructive emotions, I would think it always will depend on the outcomes of that emotion, and if the emotion is causing harm to oneself or to others. So that's kind of how I would think about it.
Yeah, Elena, would you add anything to that? What's your perspective?
I was just going to introduce a few concepts from clinical science and contemplative science and neuroscience that might be useful here, and a little bit more broadly than just talking about anger or attachment. We could make use here of a concept of self-referencing, which I'm sure Wendy will be very familiar with. And of course, we use it more broadly in mainstream neuroscience, but it's particularly relevant to neuroscience of mindfulness practice, for example, mindfulness meditation, or contemplative practices more generally. And related to that is this kind of notion of reaction versus response. So, and in clinical settings, we use the concept of functional impairment, right? So one can have any sort of emotion or experience, right? We're all humans, they will all come up at some point. But perhaps if we use the term destructive in the context of this webinar, we could think of destructive as something that is self-referenced, in Buddhist terms, you know, grasped at, identified with, and reacted to, which can then express as a destructive action, destructive behavior towards oneself or towards another human or sentient being, as opposed to a response. So let's say an anger is a highly arousing emotion. You know, we talk about arousal in subjective experiential terms is the energy that anger gives us. But if we're being responsive on the basis of this energy of arousal, we can actually have quite constructive behavioral outcome. So I would say that I second what Wendy said, that we don't talk about it in the kind of black and white ethical terms, destructive versus, you know, but we do talk about sort of social, pro-social behavior, for example, and then of course things such as greed and self-serving type of behaviors based on the emotions of anger and greed and malice of all sorts. You know, thinking of a construct of a psychopath, sorry, what am I, sociopath. And we're seeing a lot of that in our world leaders at the moment. So those kind of things, I guess, would fall under the category of destructive emotions within the scientific terminology and framework. I don't know if that helps. But, yeah.
Geshe, would you offer us the Buddhist viewpoint on what destructive emotions are?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's very similar. First of all, what Father Laurence was saying, that destructive emotions basically they disturb the natural state of mind, right? So also in our literature, in the Abhidharma philosophy, for example, it also talks about that which disturbs the nature of the mind. It's called or classified as an affliction or classified as a disturbing emotion, so to say. So that, yeah, it's very similar in that regard. So all destructive emotions like anger, and we talked about attachment, and we talked about fear, they all basically classified in a similar category, what we call non-virtuous state of mind. So that means that would produce suffering, that produces a kind of disturbance of the mind of oneself. And also according to what Wendy was talking about and Elena was talking about, it also motivates a particular activity, or it can motivate a particular activity or an outcome to harm self and others. So that's also in the Buddhist literature of psychology, that every act we engage in, physically or verbally, is preceded by a mental intention. And then if that mental intention is rooted in these kind of destructive emotions, then the outcome can also be harmful for self and others. So in that regard, there's a lot of things in common, as we can see. And yeah, by these destructive emotions, another aspect is that it's not what we classify as not in accordance with reality, as we come to that later also with the destructive perceptions. But that also the reason for it is that because it's not in accordance with reality, that's also exactly why it causes a lot of disturbance. Yeah, we don't really, in the rage of anger, we overestimate the faults of the object. While the object we angry at or the situation we angry at might also have qualities, we don't like to focus on that aspect. So even if a person tells you, oh, it's not all that bad, the person is also good in this and good in that, you say, no, not true, it's not true, right? You're convinced about you believe the faults, but you don't really like to believe the qualities. So that's also an aspect that is not in accordance with reality. And next to disturbance of mind, also you lose the clarity of mind. So you lose the clarity for problem solving, for example. So yeah, that's mostly how we more or less define in general what we classify as destructive emotion, like anger, for example. Yeah.
And the Geshe Namdak, both you and Father Laurence mentioned this natural state of peace, which is really encouraging. We're talking about disturbing emotions, but both of you mentioned this natural state that's not disturbing, which I think it'd be very nice to hear why that's the case. Is that really the case, that our natural state is not disturbed, not angry, not attached, not frustrated? Can you explain the basis for understanding that? Starting with Geshe, I think, from the Buddhist point of view.
Yeah, that's very true, because these destructive emotions, as we know, they not always present, right? They come up by the power of certain kind of external conditions, as far as Laurence indicated as well. So by particular kind of circumstances, it gets triggered, and then it abides for some time and then disintegrates. So that's a proof that it's not what we call an innate part of the mind. Yeah? So often we take a kind of analogy with the blue sky. Yeah, so like in the UK, we have a lot of overcasts, as you know. So mostly the clouds obscures, us from seeing the blue sky, but the blue sky is still there. So that means, in a similar way, these destructive emotions, if we don't subdue our mind, if we don't, act or respond, as Elena was saying, with applying antidotes, then we will not be able to see or abide in this blue sky. Yeah, so the clouds are not a part of the blue sky as such. So the mind is very similar, that these destructive emotions, they come, abide, and disintegrate. They're not an innate part, otherwise they should always be present. And there's different meditation techniques that can be used to recognize this innate peace of mind, so to say. And as long as you abide in that state, there's no possibility for these afflictions to arise or these destructive emotions to arise. Yeah, and sometimes it's true, no? Sometimes our life is filled with a little bit more dark clouds. Sometimes the clouds are a bit lighter, and sometimes there is a blue sky, right? So that proves that it's not an innate part of the mind. And yeah, that's why destructive emotions, but when they come, they disturb this because they obscure us from seeing the blue sky, or they obscure us from experiencing this nature of the mind, so to say.
Father Laurence, would you elaborate a little bit on what you said about the natural state of peace in our mind? That what's the basis for understanding that as our natural state, and that the disturbing emotions as not as primary?
Well, you're right. We're starting from this assumption that this is our natural state, and that does come as an affirmation from the contemplative wisdom traditions.
Yeah.
So we have to take that on trust, because we don't know it for sure. And there are many people who have come to a very unhappy stage of their life where they are convinced that they are inherently doomed, or inherently depressed, or inherently addicted, or inherently unlovable, and they are really struggling with this overwhelming negative view of themselves. So it does, this is something we have to trust from the wisdom traditions, and there's a humility in that, but there's also a reasonableness about it. If you sincerely want to try it, in a way, you've got nothing to lose either. So I would say in the biblical picture of creation, which, needless to say, is not meant to be taken literally, God created the human being in the divine image and likeness. That's the literal translation, image and likeness. Well, the early commentators wrestled with this. They liked this kind of thing. They would spend their life trying to work out what was the image and what was likeness. What were these two different things? So one of the explanations they give for this, which I think is psychologically quite sound and also in tune with the contemplative wisdom, is that essentially, as the Buddhist might say, we have Buddha nature. As the Christian would say, we are in the image of God. We are an icon, not just a photograph, but a living icon or hologram almost, a kind of thing of the divine. So that's our image. But then what about the likeness? So the likeness is something that we build up, we come to over our lifetime. So we start at some point being aware of ourselves, of our problems, but also hoping that there is at the core of our being this essential goodness, this essential compassion, this essential virtue, or whatever. So then some of the monastic fathers would use this image of painting, that we have to build, it's like painting a portrait. So the person starts off with this image, which is the outline of the person in this divine icon nature. But then that has to be the painting, the portrait has to be built up over time with layers, and gradually the likeness of the person begins to appear, the complete uniqueness of that person. And that shows it to be, I think, a much more dynamic conception of growth, rather than just saying, I've got all these problems, I've got to solve them. We can see it in a more dynamic way, that we are actually building up this portrait, as it were, of our true self around this image. And then they have a lovely concluding idea here, which is the last thing a painter does to add to the portrait is the smile.
Wendy, I know you were raised Christian and you're an accomplished scientist, and I know you have some experience with Buddhist practice too. So I'd love to hear your reflection on that, innate goodness or virtue of the mind, since you have, all three perspectives.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about through all these lenses. I think from the science perspective, just my own view is that we wouldn't really postulate a kind of natural or baseline state. And actually, this is debated in science as well in different philosophies, right? So I think everyone has a different perspective on how this emerges. But thinking biologically, I would think that, everyone that comes into this world has certain conditionings right from the start. So, genetic, and we're learning more and more about epigenetic kinds of transmission, intergenerational transmission of trauma, for example, or things like resilience. And then of course the conditions that you're born into, the family situation and all of that will set up the kind of patterning, of one's mind that is in fact appropriate. It's considered to those conditions. And if they're very negative conditions, you can have all of these difficult kinds of outcomes. But I think when I think of a natural state, so I guess I don't equate that with like a baseline, but I do think of it more as like a potential. So regardless of the conditions or experiences, or, like Father Laurence was saying, some people feel like I am just innately depressed, or these are, it's kind of hardwired. I think more and more what neuroscience is showing us, and contemplative science as well, is that there is a tremendous capacity for change throughout the lifetime, throughout the lifespan. And so I think there is this kind of possibility for this state of peace and calmness and clarity for anyone's mind, but people will have different paths and different levels of kind of difficulty and challenges to get there. So that's kind of how I think about this idea of a natural state.
Yeah, Elena, what's your take on this interesting
Well,
subject?
to add to what Wendy already said from scientific point of view, and of course we have, in evolutionary psychology, and it very much dominates the mainstream approach to our baseline as a mental state, as the state of sort of anxiety, survival, vigilance, and separation. So I would say that this is a kind of almost like an accepted dogma upon which a lot of our Western society is actually based. And because we also perceive animals as being primarily in the context of predator and prey relationship, and there's sort of primal emotions and drives and instincts being to kill or survive. A lot of our Western social fabric is actually very deeply imbued with that notion that this is our baseline, I think, to my reading. But I also, as Wendy said, came across other models, and particularly in the context of positive psychology. Fortunately, I cannot recall the name of the geneticist at the moment, but maybe Wendy can help me. But she actually proposed a view that we should completely, cross that one out and entertain the possibility, at least, that serenity, contentment, connectedness is our primary baseline. But that's get disturbed when we put into the state of fight or flight response. So I think the best we can do as scientists at this point is to keep that question open, and often we do not. And also there's very interesting work by, again, I think my mindfulness is no longer helping to maintain my brain structure, so I'm forgetting the names of all the things I've come across and the researchers I read the works of, but he's a researcher in University of Westminster in London, and he collected very interesting catalog of spontaneous experiences. We can call them mystical experiences by people who, entirely secular, didn't really have much of a conceptual framework within which this can be sort of suggested experiences, as we can explain them away as such, which they have this kind of spontaneous experience, ruptures of this, state of clarity, lucidity, and love. We can re-evaluate and reformulate everything that we have learned under the framework of survival, flight and fight is our primary baseline. Change, turn the tables around and reframe everything from the point of view that Geshe Namdak has outlined from a Buddhist perspective, that, the sky, the serenity, the clarity is the baseline, and all this sort of destructive emotions, is when they come up, when we grasp or self-reference them and react to them, they obstruct our view of this natural state. So as scientists, we're not playing, we're not playing with different perspectives as much as, in my opinion, we should be.
Yeah, Wendy.
I can just chime in one more perspective there. Thanks, Elena, for raising those. It made me think of, in social psychology, there's also a theory being developed called social baseline theory. This is the work of Jim Cohn and others. And this comes out of work on hand-holding studies in situations of being under threat. And if you look in the brain, threat systems are active, if there's a potential that you might get shocked or something like that. And then if you're holding a hand of someone you care about, that threat system is reduced, which seems pretty intuitive, I think, to all of us. But this work comes out of the idea that it, just like you said, Elena, in fact, it's not that the holding of the hand is reducing some kind of thing that's already there. It's that the baseline is that we are socially connected, and the absence of that connection, it kind of increases our threat system and our threat level, which makes a lot of sense, I think, of what we're learning in social psychology. And so I feel like there is this kind of shift that's happening from the evolutionary perspective of how we actually are designed. You know, we did evolve as social animals. And so I think in many ways we're wired to have that connection and dependence on others. And so when we don't, that's you know, causes many problems.
Yeah, very nice. Wendy, you this is starting to turn towards the antidotes of how to counter destructive and disturbing emotions. Like Father Freeman talked about love being the opposite of fear, you know, and I assume the antidote of fear. I wonder if, Wendy, you could start us out with the scientific perspective on some of the antidotes to disturbing emotions, like, you know, anger, craving, fear.
Yeah, the way I think about this is kind of in a broad way. There are many, of course, clinical approaches that have been developed, like reappraisal or acceptance, and these kinds of ways of dealing with emotions. And also, of course, mindfulness and contemplative practices are heavily used now as well. But I think about it, again, coming from a really fundamental kind of neurological, biological level. We need to, whatever we do to work with them, we need to basically repattern these entrenched patterns that have, you know, been developed over the course of our lives, and potentially intergenerationally, you know, now that we're learning. So that can be done in many ways, I think. And like I was saying, the capacity of the brain to change, and all we're learning about neuroplasticity. And when I say neural patterning, I really mean the entire body. I don't just mean like the brain or neurons in particular. It's all interconnected. But so this capacity for change, and there's something I think about activating the pattern that we want to change, and then kind of inserting a different, like you kind of have to carve a different path. And to do that, you have to kind of be working with the path that's active. Just kind of when you think about how neural systems are created in a cellular way. So I think that speaks to a lot about the ability that comes up a lot in contemplative practice to sit with difficult emotions, recognize them, approach them with, you know, acceptance and love, like Father Laurence was saying. That's such an important factor, I think, not like a clamping down or a pushing away. But I think more and more we're learning that the role of acceptance, not in the way that everything's just fine and we're going to leave that as it is, but kind of a loving embrace of what is actually happening. And then beginning to, through all these methods, you know, create a different pathway, a different outcome. So I think that's how I think about antidotes kind of writ large. And then again, there's many different forms that can take.
Yeah, the way you describe this sounds, you know, very much describe some of the meditations I'm familiar with as antidotes. I wonder if Geshe Namdak could talk a little bit about, you know, antidotes to disturbing emotions from the Buddhist perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, what Wendy just indicated, that we have to repattern, and she talked about acceptance and the possibility to change in neuroplasticity. So we have this kind of potential of the mind, as Father Laurence refers to as kind of, you know, the icon nature, so to say. So that's kind of the blue sky, right? But then we have to get rid of those clouds. Yeah, so those clouds would sometimes come up. So there are the destructive emotions. So we have to go back to this baseline mental state, as Elena was referring to. So how do we do that? We have to use kind of to repattern, so to say, or to of course, the first initial step is acceptance, right? It's kind of a very kind of, I would say, objective kind of approach. You know, you analyze the problem, right? That's what we do without getting involved in the problem itself. You just look from a scientific point of view, as a neutral observer, you analyze what happened. And then by that observance, you have, first of all, have acceptance, because we're not perfect yet, right? But we have this potential of this Buddha nature, or this God icon nature, so to say. Yeah. So then if that acceptance is there, then because of that acceptance, we have automatically a neutral perspective. Automatically, we can just observe instead of engaging, right? So that also helps us to prevent suppressing. As Father Laurence in his first, explanation said, we should not let it go, take over our mind, neither should we suppress it. So this acceptance is the first step. Then the next step is to analyze the faults of the destructive emotions. The more we are convinced about, for example, same is true for a particular addiction we have of drinking or eating or smoking, whatsoever. If we really convinced about the faults, then it helps our mind to generate a kind of intention not to engage in that particular act. Yeah, so our destructive emotions are very similar in the way they appear, though they don't use kind of correct form of logic or reasoning, but within a few split seconds, we can define a person or situation as extremely bad because of this, because of that, because of that. So our mind is inclined to use reasoning to prove something and then believe it. So that potential of our human intelligence we use in a kind of analytical research, analyzing the faults of the destructive emotions from a very neutral perspective, yeah, and then see the benefits of the antidote, for example, patience versus anger. Yeah, if you have a mind of patience and you see the benefits, you're still in control. You don't lose this kind of nature of the mind, so to say, and you keep your mind cool. And also the clarity is there. Yeah, with anger, there's no clarity, as we discussed. So if you see the faults of anger and be convinced about the benefits of practicing patience, then your acting in normal life becomes a much more constructive way of moving forward. Yeah, so it's a kind of a contemplation about analyzing the faults of destructive emotion and the benefits of the antidotes like patience versus anger, for example, or contentment versus attachment. So it's a kind of, you're balancing the mind in a way, you can call it to repattern the mind, as Wendy likes to use that term. So it's a similar way. We just be convinced about the faults of destructive emotion and the benefits of its antidote, and then the transformation happens. So there's then no suppression, and there's also and acceptance is there, and the transformation happens. It's kind of actually transforming these kind of states of mind, and then you prevent the next time an irritation comes, you be alert because acceptance is there. Because of that alertness, you be more in control, and you can analyze, do I follow this or not? Based on your previous kind of contemplations on the faults of destructive emotion, anger, and the benefit of practicing patience. And then because of that analytical approach you've done on a regular basis when you're not angry, then at the time irritation comes, in the first moments of that, you can still make a decision before it's too late, before the emotional hijack sets in, so to say. So we still have that freedom before that happens. Yeah.
Geshe, when you describe these antidotes, it's very logical and rational and analytical approach. And obviously we're talking about emotions, things that tend to overwhelm people. So what would you say to, people caught in the throes of emotion? Like how do you get to that rational state to be so logical about something so emotional?
I mean, it's kind of different ways of looking at situation. If you don't understand the problem, you will never be able to solve it, right? Yeah. So if you watch a movie and you're completely engaged, and if a person walks past and said, "Hello, how are you doing?" You say yes, but you don't really recognize the person because you're involved in the movie, right? So in a similar way, if we involved in this emotional hijack, there's no capacity to do anything, right? So the first step is to be the observer, instead of being the person, being the emotional hijack person, right? So you be the observer. So in a similar way, you can think about a person watching a movie and you watching the person as well as the movie from the corner of your eye. So you observe the two phenomena, but you're not engaged in the movie, that you keep your clarity of the mind. So in a similar way, when we think about events of the past, it's easier because we have dealt with it to a certain extent and, the emotion might have come up. So then we look at an event out of the past and try to recall it without getting involved. And then just have this kind of neutral perspective as the person watching a movie and watching the movie without getting involved. And then you analyze what happened, how did I react? What did it do to my mind? What did it do to others? Without getting involved, without getting irritated again. So that's the first step. Yeah. So in order to come to that, you have to have this acceptance, and you have to have a little bit of kind of what we call kind of mindfulness or awareness building of recognizing these states of mind. Yeah.
You know, this reminds me of the conversation Elena and I had about this, about getting that distance, where I use the terms objective and subjective, and you very kindly corrected me to the more neutral terms, third person and first person. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on, you know, the antidotes to disturbing emotions, and you know, comment on what Geshe has described about that, more just having some distance from your emotions.
I was preparing quite a different comment in my head.
Oh, please go right ahead and reflect on that. Then that's fine. That's fine. Sorry
I
to
can switch and talk to that. But
oh no, go ahead and reflect.
There were a couple of things I wanted to mention from what we know from the affective neuroscience in terms of kind of brain dynamics during emotion regulation, and the examples of sort of suppression, you know, pushing things away, just blocking it out. Versus reappraisal that Wendy has mentioned, or cognitive restructuring, and then how mindfulness fits in. And I think the case of depression is a very good one there. And although I'm not a clinician, I have co-facilitated a number of groups using mindfulness-based intervention for people with depression. And also it's interesting that the first studies of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or MBCT, they showed that mindfulness-based therapy was particularly effective for people who had more than 3 episodes of depression, 3 or more. So where this sort of depressive mood became a habitual pattern. So I will try to be as quick about this and not to throw too many brain areas, but there are a few interesting points which I think are very relevant here, and where science can be useful contributor. And of course, you know, we all know from the time of Freud, and based on the personal experience, that suppression is not a very good emotional regulation strategy. And from neuroimaging studies, we know that in order to suppress, you have to use your prefrontal cortex to drive the activity of amygdala down. But what you see after a while is that, you know, the prefrontal cortex is this bit at the front of our brains. It's quite effective at the beginning, but then amygdala starts to ramp up its activity. So, and then, you know, we know from our daily life that we might have suppressed anger here, but then we went and we shouted at our child or spouse, you know, 5 minutes later, because it's became uncontrollable and overwhelming. In terms of cognitive reappraisal or cognitive restructuring, what we do know, again, sort of same players, prefrontal cortex, but slightly different part of it, now lateral as opposed to more middle, down-regulates, again, amygdala, but it down-regulated by, let's say, we have came up with a positive way of seeing things, right? And used language, tends to be on the left side of the brain, to reappraise things, to take a perspective on things. And amygdala responded by, you know, coming down to some extent. How this process is effective, but it's very metabolically expensive. Okay, it takes a lot of metabolic energy for this process to occur. Now, if you're a person with depression, you're already quite drained energetically, right? So if then you have to repeatedly, and also, you know, if you had 3 episodes, your mind, your natural kind of propensity would be generate negative thoughts, negative reactions to pretty much every stimuli, whether it's neutral or actually, you know, in some way negative, or even positive. So then you have to do this task repeatedly. And it's, I've seen it so many times when people with depression say, yes, CBT worked for me, cognitive behavioral therapy, where they learn to reappraise, to use this sort of cognitive ways to frame something from negative to positive. And they start with this kind of enthusiasm of the beginner, but they become even more depleted. And so often they just give up on this, you know, and they sunk back into depression. And so mindfulness, where they just learn that experiences are transient, and you can have positive experience, you can have negative experience, as long as there is no identification or self-reference in the term that I used. There is no problem. If you see a cloud as a transitory event through the sky, and you haven't lost the sight of the sky, no matter how many clouds are there, you still know the sun is shining, and they will pass. And it doesn't matter whether it's a white and puffy cloud or whether it's a thundery one. Same, just no self-referencing, no judgment, no evaluation, no reaction. Just simply aware. That's a kind of secular mindfulness approach, and of course that's Dzogchen approach in Buddhism, and that works much more effectively for them. And they actually report. I've seen it so many times where by about session 4 or 5 of MBCT, which is 8-week intervention, penny drops, they understand how to make that subtle experiential rotation, where it doesn't matter what you're experiencing. What matters is how you're experiencing it. What is your relationship to your experience? They report sleeping better, having more energy, doing more exercise, engaging more with their friends and family, just because they have more energy. They naturally able to be more positive. And within the framework of secular mindfulness, there's this continuous debate, which is important and should carry on, whether compassion should be taught alongside pure mindfulness, because we can get a sort of mindful sniper. But what is telling for me from studies by William Koiken and his clinical trials is that even though compassion wasn't taught and is not taught as part of MBCT, the mechanism of change is and reduction in depressive symptoms is the increase in self-compassion, which then translates to compassion for others. So this is very interesting to me. So that it's like two sides of the coin. If you can see your experiences as transitory, if you have this clarity, that wisdom, then the affective component of it, which we can refer to as compassion, naturally arises. And again, it's something that I think we need to study more in contemplative neuroscience. For example, I don't know, Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of the study that directly compared, let's say suppression, cognitive appraisal, maybe using Buddhist antidotes, and just resting, in the nature of mind. And they looked at the difference in the neural dynamics and metabolic efficiency, of this dynamics of metabolic hunger, of which dynamic. Wendy, are you aware of any studies that actually directly compared within the same participants? I'm not. And I can't get the funding. No one wants to give me funding to do it.
Yeah, that would be a fantastic study, and I'm not aware of it. I really appreciate you raising the metabolic issue. I think it's huge, and I think it's not really discussed enough in the scientific frame of just how much literal energy we're talking about to do these kinds of, if you're going to be remodeling neural circuits or bodily patterns, it takes physical energy to do that. And just like you said, it can be an exhausting process depending on how you go about it. So I think I've been thinking about this more and more, in so many in really every contemplative practice I've come across, there's a lot of stillness, right? You go on retreat, there's so much removal of information that you are normally processing, right? It's silent usually. You're not engaging with people. You're not engaging with the outside world, reading the news, even like your meals are prepared. There's so much energy that is freed up.
Released, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is really huge. Just thinking about the stress of the modern world and how generally exhausted we all are, and how much energy is required for transformation. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, and I find you can change yourself from a person whose glass is half full, from a person whose glass is half empty by antidotes and cognitive restructurings. But you might find that your glass is half full, but your bottle is empty if you do too much of it. and that is my personal experience, actually. I find just practicing, not being caught up releases energy. But if I constantly practice reframing in positive terms, I was like, come on. I'm tired.
Father Laurence, I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about the antidotes to disturbing emotions from the Christian contemplative perspective.
Well, I think these are all universal human issues, aren't they? But the different traditions, and the scientific and the monastic and the contemplative are all different, offer different approaches and different methods. There's a story from the desert monastic tradition of a monk who was living in a monastery, and he was just not getting on with anybody. He was always in conflict with everybody, and he would fly off the handle, and he was a very angry, difficult person. And eventually he said to himself, I'm not making any progress here. So these people are just so annoying. I need to be on my own. So he goes off to a cave. And on the first day that he's in the cave, he goes down to the river to get some water in a jug. He puts the jug on the table and then accidentally knocks it over. But it's okay, I have nothing else to do. So he goes down to the river, fills it up again, brings it back, and again, accidentally knocks it over. A little bit annoyed this time, but still not in control. So he goes down a third time. Same thing happens when he comes back with the jug of water. It falls on the ground and he just loses it completely. He picks up the jug and he smashes it on the ground and he jumps up and down and he's cursing and venting all his anger. And of course, he has realized that the anger, he can't blame the anger on anyone. It's part of him. So he goes back to his teacher, and his teacher said, well, your cure is to live with these people who make you so angry and deal with it. So I think what Elena was saying about the two sides of the coin is very important. If we think of spirituality or a spiritual contemplative approach to the human condition, it's a kind of a health care. We're trying to care for the overall health of the person, of ourselves. And medicine is essentially an art. It's informed by science, and I don't want to say anything bad today about medication on the day after we discovered the vaccine. So let's be grateful for medical science and medication. But when we come to these negative afflictions or these faults, these destructive emotions, as we call it, our culture tends to go first of all to the medication. Let's solve this with a prescription, with a pill, just whatever the side effects may be. So the alternative to medication, and I mean, there are some conditions where you obviously do need medication, types of schizophrenia or desperate depression and so on. But generally speaking, the better alternative to medication is meditation. And I would say the antidotes for the destructive emotions are the fruits that come from the practice of meditation. So it's a self-healing process. The healing is within ourselves if we allow the right conditions to develop. And of course, if we stay with the practice. There's no alternative but to stay with and have a regular practice. And then I think we can see that we actually have a very broad palette of colors to paint this painting, of different methods and treatments that we should use wisely. And that's where, to be in touch with a wise guide and a caring community is really important, I think, for healing ourselves or being healed of these destructive emotions over time. And to find the self-healing that as the real source of transformation. So what are some of those fruits of meditation? And meditation itself, but also some of the other practices, all the practices that are associated with it, the kind of constellated around a central meditation practice. Well, there's solitude. One of the things you notice in community is that if people can't be on their own for periods of time, they will find it very difficult to get on with community. Solitude and community. Then there's self-control, one of the fruits of the spirit, according to St. Paul. And self-control is also essential, but you can't rely on it just by itself, because not many of us have that kind of self-discipline. So we need to balance the self-control with being a bit relaxed about ourselves, knowing that we're going to make the same mistakes or repeat the same patterns, and we don't have to beat ourselves up. Spiritual guidance. And that's a little different from just going to your doctor and getting a prescription. And that will depend very much upon the personalities and how lucky you are, and what kind of chemistry you have with the people who you may find as your spiritual guides. But one of the things that my own teacher did for me right from the beginning was to sort of prick the bubble of my ego or of my mistakes or my illusions, but in a humorous or in a gentle way, but a very, very revolutionary way as well. So some kind of spiritual guidance, I think, is over a long period of time, is really valuable. Service of others, so that we can take the attention off ourselves. We don't have to be analyzing and thinking about ourselves or our problems, or, mindfulness sometimes gives the impression of the way it's talked about, as if it's sort of constant self-observation. But we need time also where we are just really giving our attention to others whose needs are real, and as real, maybe in greater than our own needs. That's part of it as well. And what I like, although I don't put this into effect as much as I should personally, but the desert monks were very keen on manual labor. They said, for a lot of these conditions, just get up and go out and dig or chop wood or draw water or paint or cut the grass or whatever. So to really allow the body and the mind to be absorbed in something other than our own self-reflection. So it's a combination, like in any good medical treatment, it's a combination of, because it is a complex problem. The healing of this disordered mind can be very complex. So we need a variety of methodologies.
Each of you has touched on the points of the ego or self-referencing as being an aspect of a distorted mind versus an undistorted mind. Maybe that's a last question that we can talk about before we go to the audience. Elena, you've talked about this as self-referencing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what is distorted about or is it distorted to have that self-referencing or egotistical point of view versus the one where, you know, you get out of yourself even through manual labor?
Mhm. I would actually draw a distinction between ego and self-referencing, because well, in Buddhism we often talk about, you know, getting rid of ego, but also some commentators and some teachers make very useful point that maybe it's not the most useful or accurate way to say, just to talk about Buddhism as, you know, a doctrine of no self, but rather discovering what is not self. And from the point of view of functionality, you know, ego is a useful functional process. You know, the ignorant bit is when we start treating it as an independent, separately existing, fixated entity. That's what, and that's the self-referencing bit. So it's identification. And my teacher, Tsogni Rinpoche, with whom I learned Dzogchen, you know, he makes a distinction between what he calls mere I and reified I. And when we meditating, when we're resting in the nature of mind, you know, when we can have periods where even the experience of mere I dissolves. But as soon as we start acting, interacting, and I have to navigate, you know, around the table without bumping into it, ego as a functional process will emerge. But as long as I don't self-reference, don't grasp, don't reify, don't identify, another term we use, cognitive fusion, you know, there are many terms we use across the base traditions. There's no problem. And then my interaction, you know, even if I'm, you know, I have to use my functional ego to talk to you right now. You know, I have to have some sense and use my autobiographical processes to construct this narrative, you know. And ego, you know, I'm grateful to my ego to enable me to do that, right? But when it becomes egocentric is when this process becomes reified or self-referenced. And then, you know, it's interesting, this question of distorted perceptions. And again, we can talk about sciences within science that will probably treat this quite differently. And of course, I'm thinking about continental phenomenologists as well and philosophers of mind. You know, in the mainstream neuroscience, we often use the language that very much relates to our naive experience of reality. It's even called naive realism. You know, I'm here, the world is out there, and neuroscientists have another nuance there. Well, and the brain somehow represents it all. We don't know how. You know, if you ask us really in detail, we'll have a lot of theories and lots of terminology to throw at you. But how, we have no idea, really. Okay. And then the more you start digging deeper into neuroscience, and when you start to bring in the subtle questioning and the philosophy of mind and the techniques in continental phenomenology, and I'm thinking about, you know, epoche and bracketing, which is like practicing meditation in Buddhist sense, where you bracketing simply means you remove any judgments, any habitual judgments about your reality. You suspend them about how you perceive things, and then you discover without either affirming or denying things as existent or non-existent. You simply get in touch with your lived experience. And from the point of view of neuroscience, what we know about, even from the naive mainstream neuroscience, which deals with kind of naive realist framework and describing how things appear to us within that framework, in a way, this belief is distorted reality already, right? Because what we perceive, how we perceive, is very much based on our perceptual apparatus, on our brain structure, on what Wendy was mentioning in relation to answer to a different question, you know, the genetic and epigenetic mechanisms in in Buddhist terms, our collective species karma or habitual patterns of perception, plus our individual one on top of that through our bringing and our particular genetics and epigenetics. And of course, take an example. The dictum, you are what you eat, is actually very accurate. How we perceive reality also depends on our neurochemistry. I take a coffee, I'm already a better person. Usually my clear lucidity go up. One of my Dzogchen teachers says there is no proper Dzogchen practice without caffeine, and I agree with her. But then you take a magic mushroom and your reality shifts completely, right? So the only thing that we can learn is that our brain and the whole body, but brain in particular, one of its purposes is to fixate our perceptual world to a certain extent, so we're able to operate in it. But you can think of many ways in which we can perturb the status quo, and our perception of reality shifts considerably. So in other words, from the scientific point of view, any perception of reality as fixed and unchangeable would be considered distorted.
Yeah.
And then there are, of course, lots of nuances within that.
This seems like a good moment for Geshe Namdak to talk a little bit about what is this distorted sense of I, and how does it relate to disturbing emotions, and is there a healthier sense of self or I?
Yeah, I mean, it's very evident even how these destructive emotions come up. First of all, if you talk about anger, then we overestimate the faults of its object, right? So even certain scientific findings come to a similar conclusion. Like Aaron Becker talks about it, 80 to 90% of what's been perceived in mind and rage of anger is mentally fabricated. So we work with what we call mental images, which are not actually the reality, but we believe it's the reality. Yeah, if you walk away from a person you're annoyed with, then you walk away not with a person, you walk away with a thought, right? And then you walk away with a thought, and on that particular thought, you build up all these thoughts. So actually, you're angry with the mental image and not with the actual person, so that causes a problem. And how does this build up? Exactly because of this ego identity. Yeah, as Father Laurence said, one of his own teachers was picking him to let come up the ego in Buddhist monastic institution, where I've been part of for more than 2 decades. There's a kind of way to tease each other until the way that you almost get angry. And then your classmate will say, hey, look, you're almost getting angry. Your eye is coming up, your ego is coming up. So it's a very healthy way to approach it. And in one way, it's true. If you have asked everybody on the other side of the screen, please get angry, everybody. Come on, please get angry. It's very difficult, right? But if I say, oh, you look like this, and your glasses like this, and your haircut is like this, then people get annoyed, and then anger comes up. So it's connected with an ego identity. So this ego identity, the way it appears, is not in accordance with reality. In the same way, the mind of anger works with this kind of mental images, which is not reality. And this ego identity is also, appears as a very concrete, from its own side, egocentric, as Elena is referring to, kind of entity, right? So does it exist the way it appears? That's a big question in Buddhist philosophy, as you know. And the mere I, what Elena also referred to, that's kind of an I or conventional self, as we say, on the mere collection of the aggregates. So aggregates on body and mind. So separate from body and mind, or within body and mind, there's something to be found that is this ego identity, or this inherent from its own self existing I. And it's very interesting, and that David Bohm came to very interesting conclusions using mathematics to prove this kind of wholeness, and to prove that this ego identity, as we have in our minds, which strives for money, power, security, etc., he said it's just a show. But it's a very convincing show, and that's what most people take it as an apparent reality. Yeah, so, and especially what Elena was referring to, if there's a lot of habituation patterns with people with depression, it's more difficult to understand that depression and to get rid of it. So with this ego identity is even more severe. The habituation, is much stronger. So to recognize it as a problem is even more a kind of a challenge, so to say. But from these examples of see when you get angry, it's all reconnected with this self-centeredness, right? That how dare this person say this to me? Or with attachment, I need this, I need that. And so in Buddhist philosophy, we talk about a concrete I that is more or less seen upon, right? The body and mind. And because of that concrete I that appears, then also the possessive aspect come into the picture, like my computer, my this, my that. So because of this kind of, it's been considered as the building blocks for the destructive emotions, so to say. Because all the destructive emotions are rooted in a very self-centeredness, as Father Laurence indicated with this anger of this individual in the desert tradition, the same thing. As soon as we get angry, it's, as we just saw with the example, is rooted in this concrete concept of I am I, right? And that's with all destructive emotions, same thing. With anger or anxiety, same thing. People are having particular fear, misunderstanding reality. To them, it is maybe not the case. So a lot of things are rooted in this concrete aspect of reality that is maybe not really there, and that we have to examine.
Wendy, would you add anything from the scientific perspective on this relationship between ego identity and destructive emotions?
Yeah, there's so much to chew on with this. I think, in considering the question around distorted perceptions, it's so interesting. At first thinking about the question, it kind of stopped me in my tracks, because I think that, again, science is it depends on the frame with which you're looking through, can be exemplified with the example of, relativity theory. Someone on a train will be experiencing things in a very different way from someone on the platform watching the train go by. So for me, sometimes that comes in about, science is very hesitant to make universal claims about what is, true reality. It's like, from which perspective are you saying that? So that's just one kind of trickiness, I think, that comes in from the scientific perspective, and a huge benefit, I think, that emerges in contemplative science and engaging with contemplative traditions. For example, these questions around self and self-clinging and ego identity. Of course, there's lots of discourse around the self in neuroscience and psychology, but I don't hear it very often from this frame of that there are problematic aspects, right, with this clinging. That's not a narrative that I think is very much in the mainstream of science or psychology, except within contemplative, which I think is a really interesting lens to go down. And one other thing that just arose for me as Geshe was speaking about the mental images that we hold and kind of project that distort our perception. There's a very increasingly popular view in cognitive science about how the mind works as a prediction machine, and kind of creating a model of the world based on all our experiences. And then that model becomes like a filter, kind of in a often very effective way to help us engage with the world, efficiently. And again, that kind of energy conservation lens, but at the same time, creating these concepts and labels and reified ideas around people or situations that that definitely distort the way that we can engage with people. So just bringing in that lens too, I think that's a really nice intersection between those perspectives.
Yeah, Elena.
But could I add something to what Geshe and Wendy brought up from a clinical experience as well, working with people with depression, also people with auditory hallucinations who don't respond to pharmaceutical pharmacotherapy. They continue having persistent hallucinations, and that aspect of identification with, I am depressed, I am depressive, I have, I am my hallucinations, I am my disorder, I am my disease. That's really when the healing, I love the point that Father Laurence has made as well, wonderful points about it's about healing, which is a journey and a path. It's not, we always look for cure and quick fixes. And the healing starts when they realize, they are not, discovering what is not self, what goes beyond this very narrowly circumscribed idea of ego identity. that I'm not just Elena Antonova born in this city and this year. And when you start disidentify with all of this, what is left? That's from point of view of my practice, that's the healing journey. And I was kind of contemplating, Wendy, whether to bring the predictive coding model framework into conversation or not, but I'm glad you did. And from that model, simply put, in simple language, every moment of experience, we project heavily upon, and we know that in different language, but it's just mathematically elaborate model that describes this. And allows us to make neural predictions how this might work on a brain level, that we never have just a pure experience of the moment in an ordinary state of mind, unless we are meditators. But even then, certain things get projected from our previous experience of the previous moment, and and everything before the Big Bang or the creation, depending on which model we're taking. But again, what I found is the most healing thing, the pivotal point, particularly for people with depression, is when they discover, I am not my depression, but also each new moment is an opportunity and invitation to experience something different. That you don't, because what they discover is that even when this moment, they're already expecting the next moment to be that experience of depression, really neatly predictive coding framework there, right? But when they discover that they don't have to, that they can, by not identifying with what they're experiencing now and not having this anticipatory expectation that they will, it will still be there in the next moment. Boom, it's a big insight, and healing starts from there. Long journey with many detours, sometimes one step forward, 2 steps back, but it's a process.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.